The paper was already there when I came back outside. Bright orange, slapped crooked against my windshield, flapping in the wind like it was proud of itself. My truck was still idling, diesel rumbling low, exhaust curling into the frozen air. It had to be running. In weather like this, you shut a diesel off, and you might as well be saying goodbye to it. Anyone who's lived through a real mountain winter knows that. The HOA, apparently, did not. The notice said I'd violated an environmental idling policy. The fine was printed in bold like a threat. Issued personally by the HOA head, Darla Witcom. I stood there with numb fingers and burning ears, staring at it, trying to understand how someone could punish the one person keeping their roads from turning into skating rinks. That truck wasn't a luxury. It paid my bills. It fed my family. More than that, it was the only thing standing between this neighborhood and chaos once the snow really came down. When I tried to explain, Darla didn't argue. She smiled, said rules were rules. Then she calmly warned me that if I didn't correct my behavior, my access to HOA roads could be reevaluated. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about air quality. It was about control. And she had absolutely no idea what she'd just started. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Ridgefall Crossing sits just outside a small Wyoming town most people have never heard of, the kind of place real winters still decide who's prepared and who isn't. Out here, winter isn't a vibe or a photo opportunity. It's a test. Roads freeze solid overnight, wind drifts snow back across anything you just cleared, and one bad decision can strand an entire neighborhood. I'd been the contracted snow operator for Ridgefall Crossing for years, and I earned that role the hard way. Not by being the cheapest, but by being the one who always showed up. I knew this place better than most of the homeowners. I knew which corners glazed over first when the temperature dropped. I knew which driveways hid drainage grates that would snap an axle if you clipped them under snow. I knew which older residents needed their access cleared before sunrise because they had medical appointments or couldn't risk walking on ice. When storms hit, I wasn't guessing. I was working from memory. My truck was the backbone of that work. An older diesel, nothing flashy, rebuilt piece by piece in my own garage. It had one hard rule, drilled into me through experience and busted knuckles in deep cold. You do not shut it off unless you absolutely have to. Diesel gels. Batteries die. Starters freeze. Kill the engine at the wrong moment. And you don't just lose a truck, you lose time, access, and safety. Everyone who had lived here longer than a year understood that. Everyone except the new HOA board. Darla Witcom arrived the previous fall, full of energy and confidence, talking about modernizing operations and tightening standards. Within weeks, she was running the HOA like a courtroom instead of a neighborhood. New policies appeared without warning. Notices went out over minor infractions that had never mattered before. She loved the word compliance. Loved it so much she used it like a weapon. Contractors weren't partners anymore. We were risks to be managed, liabilities to be controlled. The idling fine was the first time she pointed that weapon directly at me. I didn't get angry right away. I assumed it was ignorance, not malice, so I did what professionals do. I wrote an email explaining why the truck had to stay running during active snow operations. I attached manufacturer guidelines that spelled it out in plain language. I included state cold, weather advisories warning against engine shutdowns in sub-zero conditions. I even added a note from another local snow contractor backing me up, thinking that maybe hearing it from more than one source would help. The reply came back short, formal, and cold. Policy cited. No exceptions. Pay the fine or face review. No discussion. No acknowledgement of the evidence. No concern for safety. That was when the tone changed. A day later, I rolled up to the gate leading into the eastern loop and punched in my access code. The keypad blinked red. I tried again. Same result. At first, I honestly thought it was a technical issue. Batteries die in the cold. Systems glitch. It happens. So I called the HOA office. Darla's assistant answered and put me on hold for a long minute. When she came back, her voice was polite but rehearsed. She told me my access had been temporarily restricted pending compliance with HOA policies. That sentence landed heavier than the fine ever did. The eastern loop wasn't optional. It was the steepest part of the neighborhood. Shaded most of the day, the first place ice formed and the last place it melted. Blocking access there wasn't a clerical issue. It was a deliberate decision. Within hours, my phone started buzzing. Residents texting pictures of cars sliding sideways. A parent asking if I could help because they were afraid to take their kids out on the road. Someone else saying they'd barely made it up the hill without ending up in a ditch. I forwarded every message to the HOA, documenting timestamps and locations, spelling out exactly what was happening. No response came back. By evening, the weather alerts started stacking up. Freeze warnings, wind advisories, a storm system pushing in faster than predicted. I stood outside listening to the wind pick up, looking at the locked gate, and realizing something important. This wasn't about an idling engine anymore. They were willing to let the neighborhood suffer just to prove a point. And winter was only getting started. By morning, Ridgefall Crossing didn't look like a neighborhood anymore. It looked like a sheet of glass laid across the hills. Every untreated road shined under the gray sky, smooth and dangerous, the kind of ice that doesn't crack or crunch, it just waits. Walking was risky. Driving was a gamble. I stood at the locked gate, breath fogging in front of my face, and watched a sedan start down the eastern slope. The driver tapped the brakes. The car slid sideways, corrected, slid again, and finally came to a stop inches from a mailbox. The driver just sat there for a moment, hands locked on the wheel. That image burned itself into my head. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. Wide shots of the hill, close-ups of the ice, video of tires spinning without moving. I captured the locked gate, the dead keypad, the time on my screen, the temperature reading on my dash. I sent another email to the board laying it out clearly: access blocked, roads untreated, residents at risk. I used the words safety hazard and liability because I knew those were supposed to matter. Still, nothing came back. A few hours later, my phone lit up again, not with a response, but with an email blast sent to every homeowner in Ridgefall Crossing. Darla's name was at the top. The subject line talked about temporary service delays caused by vendor noncompliance. She never mentioned the locked gate, never mentioned the fine. She made it sound like I had simply failed to do my job. I felt that shift in my chest then, the moment where frustration hardens into something sharper. This wasn't confusion or mismanagement. This was a narrative. She was setting me up to take the fall for a problem she'd created. Messages from residents started coming in right after. People confused, people angry. A couple asking if I was sick or refusing to work. I answered every one of them honestly, telling them access had been restricted and that I'd reported it. I didn't insult the HOA. I didn't speculate. I stuck to facts. And the more I did, the more something ugly became obvious. Late that afternoon, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Evan Pike, the former board treasurer. He said he'd stepped down a few months earlier because he couldn't get straight answers about spending. He asked me a simple question: had I ever noticed invoices for snow work that didn't make sense? I told him I had. Bills for storms that barely dusted the ground. Charges that didn't match hours worked or equipment used. Things I'd written off as bookkeeping mistakes because I didn't want to believe anything worse. Avon asked if we could meet. That night, we sat in his garage with the door cracked open for air, the smell of oil and cold metal around us. He didn't waste time. He pulled out a small flash drive and set it on the workbench like it weighed more than it should. What was on it wasn't messy accounting. It was organized. Too organized. Payments routed to companies I'd never heard of. Emergency plowing charges on days when the sky had been clear. Identical line items repeating across different vendors, like someone had copied and pasted the same story over and over, just changing the names. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. As I scrolled through the files, my phone buzzed again. Another HOA email. This one announced that the board was exploring alternative snow service options to ensure reliability moving forward. The language was polished, almost cheerful. No mention of the locked gate. No acknowledgement of the ice. Just a quiet declaration that they were looking for someone new. That's when it hit me all at once. They weren't trying to solve a problem. They were creating cover. The fine, the gate lock, the email blaming me. It all pointed in the same direction. Push me out, replace me, and keep whatever game they'd been running hidden under fresh tracks. I shut off my phone and leaned back in my chair, staring at the rows of numbers on the screen. I'd seen this pattern before, years ago, in a different line of work. The moment when a bully stops reacting and starts planning. And I knew one thing for sure. If they thought I was just the plow guy, they were about to make a very expensive mistake. 2 days later, the replacement showed up. I heard it before I saw it. A louder engine than mine. Revving too hard. The kind of sound that tells you the driver doesn't know the terrain yet. When the truck rolled past the main entrance, my stomach dropped. Out of state plates. Fresh paint. The company name slapped crooked on the door like it had been done in a hurry. No phone number. No licensing decals. Nothing that said this was a crew that had ever worked a Wyoming winter. I pulled out my phone and filmed everything. The truck, the plates. The driver shaking hands with a board member near the clubhouse. I caught the whole exchange from a distance. Steady hands, slow pan, no drama. Experience had taught me that proof only works if it's boring and undeniable. When I got home, I looked the company up. Then I looked again, thinking maybe I'd misspelled it. Nothing came back. No state registration, no insurance listing, no contractor license, just a hollow name floating on the internet with no footprint behind it. A shell. That alone would have been bad enough. But later that afternoon, while driving the perimeter to document untreated areas, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The emergency access lane, the one cut through the trees behind the eastern ridge, was blocked. Not snowed in, not drifted over. Blocked on purpose. A heavy chain looped through the gate, secured with a padlock and a keypad mounted beside it. That lane wasn't optional. Fire trucks used it. Ambulances used it. In heavy storms, it was the only way in or out when the main road iced over. And now it was locked. No notice had gone out. No vote had been taken. No emergency exception posted. Someone had made a decision quietly, without witnesses, and that decision put lives at risk. I didn't argue. I didn't call the HOA again. I did what I knew how to do. I called the county. I reported an obstructed emergency route and requested a case number. I emailed photos and video within minutes of hanging up. I included the location, the time, the weather conditions, and the lack of posted authorization. Then I made one more call. A number I hadn't dialed in years. Megan Holt answered on the second ring. We'd worked around each other years earlier when I handled administrative investigations. She knew my voice. She knew I didn't exaggerate. I told her everything, start to finish, without emotion. The fine, the locked gate, the replacement truck, the invoices. The emergency lane. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Then she said something that shifted the ground under all of it. "This isn't an HOA dispute anymore," she said. "This is liability." She explained it calmly, like she was laying out a map. Blocking emergency access during known winter conditions wasn't just reckless. It was actionable. Combined with evidence of financial irregularities and retaliatory behavior, it crossed from mismanagement into exposure. Civil exposure. Possibly more. By the end of the call, we had a plan. Megan helped me prepare an emergency request for injunctive relief. The goal was simple and urgent. Force the HOA to restore access immediately and freeze discretionary decisions until a formal audit could be conducted. We attached everything: photos, timestamps, emails, invoices, weather advisories, and the county report number. When the filing went through, the tone from the HOA changed overnight. Emails that had gone unanswered suddenly came back polite and vague. Darla asked for clarification, asked for patience, asked if we could discuss concerns collaboratively. It was the first time she'd acknowledged me since issuing the fine. That told me everything I needed to know. Late that night, while I was organizing files, an unfamiliar email popped up in my inbox. The sender introduced himself as Lucas Grant, a reporter with a small regional paper. He said he'd received a tip about questionable snow contracts and locked emergency routes in Ridgefall Crossing and wanted to verify details before publishing. I didn't hesitate. I sent him the documents, not opinions, not commentary, just records, invoices, photos, filings. A clean timeline that spoke for itself. The next morning, the headline hit before sunrise. It didn't accuse. It didn't speculate. It laid out facts. Ghost snow services, unexplained payments, blocked emergency access during winter conditions. Names weren't splashed across the page, but the implications were clear enough that anyone living in Ridgefall Crossing understood exactly who it was about. By mid-morning, residents were sharing the article in group chats. Phones were ringing at the HOA office. Board members stopped answering questions and started canceling meetings. The replacement truck never came back after that day. And for the first time since the fine hit my windshield, I felt something close to calm. Because the moment the story went public, this stopped being about control. Now it was about consequences. Once the article hit, Ridgefall Crossing stopped pretending everything was normal. Group chats lit up before most people finished their morning coffee. Neighbors compared screenshots, old emails, meeting minutes, and dues statements like they were finally allowed to say the quiet part out aloud. People who had barely spoken for years were suddenly trading stories. Fines that never made sense, services that were paid for but never delivered, questions that had been brushed aside with polished smiles and vague explanations. It didn't take long for the math to start bothering people. They looked at what they paid every year and what they actually got in return. Roads that stayed icy, amenities that never seemed maintained, snow charges that kept going up even when storms were lighter than usual. The gap between promises and reality was suddenly impossible to ignore. Darla responded the only way she knew how. She sent out another mass email calling the article misleading and taken out of context. She accused unnamed parties of pushing an agenda and warned residents not to jump to conclusions. A few months earlier, that might have worked. This time, it fell flat. People were already checking the documents themselves. They didn't need interpretation anymore. What surprised even me was how fast the audit findings followed. Once the injunction triggered a formal review, things unraveled quickly. The same patterns showed up again and again. Duplicate invoices billed under slightly different descriptions. Emergency snow charges logged on days when there hadn't been measurable snowfall. and payments routed through a management company tied directly to Darla's brother, Darla Witcom. There were no competitive bids, no disclosures, no explanations that held up longer than a few minutes. The HOA tried to downplay it, calling everything clerical error, accounting mistakes, oversights. The problem with that explanation was consistency. Mistakes don't repeat this cleanly. They don't point in the same direction every time. Then the pressure turned personal. One afternoon, a county code enforcement truck pulled into my driveway. The officer stepped out calm and respectful, clipboard in hand, and told me he was responding to a complaint about unregistered equipment and improper storage. I knew immediately what it was. I'd seen this play before. I walked him through everything: registration, permits, storage compliance. He checked, nodded, and closed his folder. Everything was in order. He apologized for the inconvenience and left. I didn't let it end there. That same day, I filed a records request asking who had submitted the complaint. I didn't assume. I didn't accuse. I waited. A week later, the response came back. The complainant was Darla Witcom. Seeing her name in black and white did something strange to me. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was retaliation, plain and simple, and now it was documented. Word of that spread faster than the article had. One board member resigned quietly the following morning. Another followed 2 days later. A third stopped responding to emails altogether. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. Darla tried to hold things together by herself, but the authority she relied on only worked when people believed in it. That belief was gone when the judge issued the temporary freeze on HOA discretionary spending. It was like someone finally shut off the engine that had been running unchecked. No new contracts, no emergency expenditures without oversight, no quiet payments slipping through while everyone else argued over rules. That decision hit harder than any headline. Suddenly, Darla couldn't maneuver. She couldn't distract. She couldn't replace vendors or bury problems under fresh invoices. Every dollar had to be explained. Every decision had to survive scrutiny. The tools she'd used to control people were locked away. And winter was still building. Forecasts showed heavier systems on the way. Longer freezes. The kind of storms that don't forgive poor planning. Ridgefall crossing was heading into the worst stretch of the season with a fractured board, frozen finances, and a growing realization that the person who'd claimed to be protecting the neighborhood had actually been putting it at risk. I stood in my driveway that night, listening to the wind move through the trees, watching clouds thicken over the ridge. The cold bit deeper than before, the kind that seeps through layers and settles into bone. Winter hadn't even peaked yet, and for the first time since this started, the HOA didn't control what happened next. The notice for the special meeting went out late and vague, which only made things worse. By the time I arrived, the room was already full. Chairs were taken. People lined the walls. A few stood in the hallway craning their necks just to hear. This wasn't a routine HOA gathering where everyone nodded politely and went home frustrated. This felt like something breaking. Darla Witcom took her seat at the front and tried to open the meeting the way she always did, with rules and order and reminders about decorum. Her voice carried that same practiced calm, but it didn't land the way it used to. The room was too tight with tension. Too many people had read the article. Too many had checked their own records. The first question came before she even finished her opening remarks. A man in the second row stood up and asked why his dues showed repeated snow removal charges during weeks when his street had never been plowed. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't emotional. He just wanted an answer. Before Darla could respond, a woman near the aisle stood up too. She said her mother had needed medical transport during the freeze and wanted to know why the emergency access lane had been locked without notice. She asked who made that call and whether anyone had informed local services. Another voice cut in from the back, louder this time. Someone asked why payments from the HOA were being routed to a company connected to Darla's brother. The name was said out loud. No euphemisms. No hedging. The room shifted. Darla tried to regain control. She said the questions were based on misunderstandings. She said coincidences happen. She said paperwork can look confusing without context. She accused unnamed individuals of stirring panic and reminded everyone that investigations take time. Her words floated out and fell flat. People weren't buying explanations anymore. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were comparing notes. Every answer she gave created two more questions. Every deflection tightened the silence instead of breaking it. That's when Megan stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She simply introduced herself and explained her role. Then she laid out the audit summary point by point. Duplicate invoices, missing bids, payments that didn't align with weather data, emergency charges that didn't correspond to emergencies. She spoke slowly, clearly, and without drama. No one interrupted her. When she finished, the room went quiet in a way I'll never forget. Not awkward silence, not confusion. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've crossed a line from suspicion into certainty. Darla looked around, searching for support, but the faces looking back at her weren't angry anymore. They were resolved. Someone called for a vote. Not a symbolic one, not a show of hands to feel better. A formal vote to proceed with a full forensic audit and independent oversight. The kind of step that doesn't happen unless people are ready to see where the truth leads, even if it's uncomfortable. The motion passed unanimously, not one dissenting vote, not one abstention. Darla didn't speak after that. She gathered her papers, said the meeting was adjourned, and walked out without making eye contact. No applause followed her. No arguments, just quiet. I stepped outside into the cold air afterward and checked my phone. The weather alert had just come through. A historic blizzard warning. Heavy snowfall. Sustained winds. Conditions expected to worsen overnight and continue through the following day. The kind of storm that shuts down highways and strands communities if preparation isn't airtight. I looked back at the building, then toward the hills surrounding Ridgefall crossing. The roads were already slick. Temperatures were dropping fast, and the reality settled in like another layer of ice. The HOA had no legitimate snow contractor. The replacement truck had vanished. The finances were frozen. The board was fractured. The person who had insisted on control no longer had it. And the storm didn't care about politics, policies, or power struggles. That night the wind picked up earlier than expected. Snow started falling sideways, thick and fast, erasing tire tracks almost as soon as they formed. I stood in my driveway listening to it build, thinking about how close this neighborhood had come to disaster before anyone paid attention. For years, Darla had believed rules were enough, that authority could substitute for preparation, that pressure could replace trust. Now Ridgefall Crossing was heading into the worst weather of the season, with nothing but the consequences of those choices waiting ahead. And for the first time, everyone in that room understood exactly what was at stake. The storm didn't ease in. It slammed into Ridgefall Crossing in the middle of the night, like it had something personal to settle. By the time dawn should have broken, there was no horizon left to see, just white. Snow blew sideways in sheets so thick it erased houses, fences, roads, everything that usually told you where you were. Drifts piled higher than car hoods. Some swallowed entire driveways. The roads didn't just disappear, they ceased to exist. My phone started ringing before sunrise. Elderly residents trapped in their homes, afraid to step outside. Parents calling because their kids were coughing and the house was losing heat. A frantic voicemail about a medical emergency on the Western Ridge. Someone with chest pain, roads completely blocked. Each call landed heavier than the last because every one of them was exactly what I'd warned the HOA about. Then the calls from the board started. Not official emails this time, not policy language, just raw panic. Messages asking if I could please come plow, if I could make an exception, if I could just help them get through this one storm. I stood in my kitchen, listening to the wind howl against the windows, the diesel engine outside already warming up out of habit, and felt the weight of the moment settle in. I wanted to help. I always had. But I also knew exactly how fast doing the wrong thing could undo everything we'd fought for. So I didn't break the court order. Instead, I made one call that changed everything. I contacted County Emergency Services and explained the situation. Blocked access, no contracted snow crew. Vulnerable residents, active medical emergency. I sent them the documentation I already had on file. Within minutes, they authorized me to operate under emergency coordination, not as an HOA contractor, but as a designated support asset. That distinction mattered. I rolled out with official authorization, logged every route, every pass, every minute. I filmed my plow cutting through drifts that tried to swallow it whole. I noted times, locations, and conditions. No shortcuts, no favors. Just clean work under clear authority. When I reached the Western Ridge, a deputy was already there, lights barely visible through the snow. Together, we cleared enough access for the ambulance to get through. The patient was stabilized and transported. No speeches, no drama, just the quiet relief of knowing someone wasn't going to die because of paperwork and ego. More deputies arrived as the morning wore on. Then county investigators. They didn't ask me what happened. They already knew. They asked me to show them. I walked them through the lock gates, the untreated loops, the areas where snow had turned dangerous because access had been denied too long. They took notes, photos, statements. By the time the storm began to taper off, Ridgefall Crossing was no longer an HOA problem. It was a county issue. Sometime before noon, my phone buzzed with a message that felt strangely anticlimactic after everything else. Darla Witcom had resigned. No speech. No explanation. Just a brief notice sent out by the remaining board members stating she was stepping down effective immediately. The woman who had fined my idling truck, locked emergency routes, and tried to push me out had finally run out of places to stand. A few hours later, Evan texted me something else. Colin Whitcomb's company listings were gone. Vendor profiles wiped. Registrations pulled. It was like the trail had been erased overnight, except it was far too late for that to matter. Copies already existed. Records had already been shared. The snow finally slowed that evening, leaving behind a neighborhood battered but intact. Roads were open enough for essential travel. Emergency access was restored. People stepped outside cautiously, looking around like they were waking up after a long, bad dream. I parked my truck at the edge of the eastern loop and shut it off for the first time in days. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, snow hissing where it touched hot metal. For a moment I just sat there, hands on the wheel, listening to the quiet that follows a storm like that. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined when that fine first hit my windshield. There was no satisfaction in watching people panic or scramble. But there was something solid in knowing the truth had held. The storm didn't choose sides. It never does. But it exposed exactly who had been prepared and who had been pretending all along. The aftermath moved faster than anyone expected, like a dam finally giving way after too much pressure. Once the storm passed and investigators finished their initial work, the audit results were no longer whispers or headlines. They were official findings. Fraud wasn't suggested anymore. It was confirmed. The numbers lined up too cleanly, the patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Duplicate invoices, payments to shell vendors, emergency charges that didn't match weather records. It all pointed in the same direction, and this time there was no room left to spin it. The HOA's insurance carrier stepped in almost immediately. Coverage questions turned into damage control. Lawyers replaced board emails. What had once been handled in closed meetings was now being discussed in formal filings and recorded statements. Civil suits followed, not just from residents but from parties who had been exposed to risk because of blocked access and mismanagement. The consequences Darla had always brushed off as hypothetical became very real very fast. Her resignation didn't protect her the way she might have hoped. Within weeks, she was barred from holding any HOA leadership position statewide, her name quietly added to a list no one wants to be on. Cullen didn't fare better. Investigators tied falsified contracts and financial routing directly back to him. Charges followed, and the vendor accounts he'd relied on vanished for good. The quiet erasure he'd tried to pull during the storm only made things look worse. Ridgefall Crossing had to rebuild more than roads. It had to rebuild trust. New board elections were scheduled under county oversight, not rushed, not informal. Residents who had never attended a meeting before volunteered for roles they once avoided. People asked harder questions. Budgets were reviewed line by line. Financial oversight rules were rewritten so no single person could ever control spending the way Darla had. Every contract now required transparency, competitive bids, and documentation that anyone could request. Emergency access became its own category. No longer buried under general maintenance language, the lanes were clearly marked, protected by policy, and registered with county services. Locks were removed, codes shared with the right agencies. Signs went up explaining why those routes mattered, not just as rules, but as safeguards. The Eastern Loop was permanently designated a priority route. No exceptions, no ambiguity. It was written into the HOA's governing documents so clearly that no future board could claim ignorance. When storms hit, that loop would be treated first, every time. As winter dragged on, people started stopping me when I was out working. Not to praise, not to relive the drama, just to say thank you. They didn't talk about revenge or winning. They talked about feeling safe again. About knowing someone had been willing to stand firm when it would have been easier to walk away. That meant more to me than any apology ever could. Winter didn't end overnight. It rarely does. There were still long nights, deep freezes, and more snow to clear. But the difference was obvious. Decisions were made early. Access stayed open. Communication stayed honest. When something went wrong, it was addressed instead of hidden. The road stayed passable. Ambulances didn't hesitate. Parents didn't fear hills that had once turned into traps. The neighborhood felt quieter, steadier, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. One evening, near the tail end of the season, I parked my truck at the top of the Eastern Loop and looked down over the houses dusted with fresh snow. Lights glowed in windows. Tire tracks cut clean lines through the white. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just normal. That was the real victory. Not the fines reversed or the board reshuffled, but the simple fact that when winter showed up again, Ridgefall Crossing was ready for it. The systems worked, the rules made sense. And the people who lived there knew that safety wasn't something you enforced with threats. It was something you protected with responsibility. I shut off the engine and listened to it cool, the soft ticking blending into the quiet evening air. The cold was still sharp, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt familiar. Winter had loosened its grip, and this time the road stayed open. I never wanted authority. I never wanted a title, a seat at a table, or the last word in a meeting. All I ever wanted was to do my job and go home at the end of the day without being punished for common sense. Somewhere along the way, that became too much to ask. What this experience taught me is something I won't forget. When people use rules as weapons, the smartest response isn't anger, it's evidence. Calm outlasts intimidation. Documentation outlives threats. You don't beat control by shouting louder. You beat it by writing everything down and letting the truth speak for itself. Ridgefall Crossing learned that lesson the hard way. It took ice on the roads, locked gates, and a storm that didn't care who thought they were in charge. But it learned. The neighborhood didn't just change leadership, it changed how it thinks. About safety, about responsibility, about who rules are actually supposed to serve. These days, when the temperature drops and I leave my truck idling to keep it alive, nobody complains. Nobody takes pictures. Nobody prints orange warnings and slips them under wipers. People just lift a hand and wave as they pass by because they remember what happens when snow access disappears and ego gets in the way of preparation. That's the part no policy ever explained. So if there's one thing I hope people take from this, it's that standing your ground doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, paperwork, and refusing to bend when bending would put others at risk. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?